Hi everyone. First of all, thanks very much for inviting me to this exciting and important symposium. It is my great pleasure to be able to present our work today. My name is Tatsuya Amano, currently based at the University of Queensland in Australia. Recently, I have been focusing quite intensively on understanding the consequences of language barriers in biodiversity conservation and launched this project called the Translate Project. So today, I will introduce some of our recent work on language barriers in biodiversity conservation. So first of all, you might wonder why language matters in ecology and conservation, especially given we have English as the common language of science. Here, the map on the left shows the states and territories where English is the first language. The map on the right is the distribution of threatened species. And as you can see, we have two very contrasting maps. The regions where biodiversity is the richest and is threatened the most, and therefore conservation is needed the most, are often regions where English is not widely spoken, including the tropical countries. In a study nicely led by Pablo Nigret, we looked at the number of official languages spoken within the distribution of each of the 10,000 bird species. Importantly, we found that over 1,500 species, including 43 threatened species, had 10 or more official languages spoken within their distribution range. As you can see in this figure, some threatened species actually have 20, 30, or even 50 official languages spoken within their distribution range. So in order to study and conserve these species, we clearly need to understand the consequences of having so many languages spoken within a species distribution. Our Translate project has been investigating the many consequences of language barriers in ecology and conservation. This includes language barriers to the global synthesis of scientific knowledge, language barriers to the local application of scientific knowledge, and language barriers to the career development of non-native English speakers. So in this talk, I will explain the first two aspects of language barriers. Okay, so I will first talk about how language barriers might impede the global synthesis of scientific knowledge. First of all, how is non-English language science used in global knowledge synthesis? We looked at the proportion of references cited in these 8 IPBS assessments by language. And not surprisingly, English language references dominate in most assessments, with on average 96% of the references cited being in English. This means that scientific literature published in non-English languages is essentially ignored at the international level. So the what are the consequences of ignoring non-English language science? In this paper, published in 2016, we showed that up to 36% of scientific documents on biodiversity conservation appeared to be published in languages other than English, especially in Spanish, Portuguese, and simplified Chinese. So by ignoring non-English language science, we could be losing access to this amount of non-negligible amount of scientific knowledge. In another recent study, we also identified 1,234 non-English language studies that provide evidence on the effectiveness of conservation interventions, compared to 4,412 English language studies identified by the Conservation Evidence Project. We also identified 466 journals in 19 languages, some of which have been publishing papers since the 19th century. So by ignoring non-English language science, we could be losing access to this amount of scientific knowledge. Many people often assume that such non-English language studies are diminishing as science is becoming increasingly globalized. But in this study led by Sean Chaudhry, we showed that the number of publications on biodiversity conservation has actually been increasing in most languages, especially in Spanish, Portuguese, simplified Chinese, and Russian, and so on. So contrary to a common perception, the importance of knowing language knowledge in conservation is not certainly diminishing. And another problem is that ignoring knowing language science can cause severe biases in our understanding of biodiversity and its conservation. In the research area of healthcare, it has been shown that more statistically significant results are more likely to be published in English. This issue is known as language bias in statistical results, meaning that the nature and direction of a study's results can affect what language it is published in. And we found language bias in statistical results in ecology and conservation too. In this paper, we showed that effect size was hugely different between English language studies and Japanese language studies, although all these studies were used in the same meta-analysis. However, a slightly different type of language bias might also exist, especially in ecology and conservation, which is language bias in study characteristics. For example, studies conducted on a local species might be more likely to get published in non-English language journals, as those studies would not be of high interest to international readers. And in our latest work, we showed that language bias in study characteristics does exist, having serious consequences for evidence synthesis. These blue grid cells show the distribution of English language studies testing the effectiveness of conservation interventions stored in the conservation evidence database. And you can see that English language studies are, unsurprisingly, concentrated in certain countries, such as the UK and the US. And there is a huge gap in the availability of evidence in other parts of the world, including the most biodiverse regions, such as Latin America, Africa, and Asia. Now, when we searched non-English language studies testing the effectiveness of conservation actions using the same criteria, we found a number of relevant non-English language studies in those regions with little information based on English language studies, such as Latin America, Russia, and East Asia. This clearly indicates that there is a systematic bias in study locations between English and non-English language studies. Quite often, global assessment and studies report severe biases in the availability of scientific knowledge, but it seems that those biases are partly due to the exclusion of non-English language studies in the global synthesis of knowledge. And it's not only about locations. Here is a figure that compares the study species between English and non-English language studies. These blue bars shows the number of English language studies available for each species. And what's most important here is those red bars showing the number of non-English language studies per species for those without any English language studies. These include 217 bird and 64 mammal species, including this endangered Blackiston's fish owls in Japan and the endangered Andean mountain cats in northern Patagonia. So this result indicates that, again, there is a clear bias in study species between English and non-English language studies. And by ignoring non-English language studies, we could be losing important scientific evidence for the conservation of these important species. Okay, so let's move on to other questions of how language barriers might affect the local application of scientific knowledge. First of all, how its science made available in different languages used in local decision making. Here we have identified national reports on the state of biodiversity in countries where English is not an official language, and we looked at the proportion of references cited in those reports by language. We were surprised at the very high proportion of non-English language references in most reports, shown in yellow and orange in this figure. Across these 37 countries, 65% of the references cited was, on average, in a non-English language. And as you might remember, this is a stark contrast to the IPBES assessments, where only 3.4% of the references were written in non-English languages. This high proportion of non-English language references in national biodiversity reports is partly due to report authors recognizing the importance of non-English language scientific knowledge. For example, when we surveyed those report authors, 75% of them answered that they cited non-English language papers because they were indeed relevant to their reports. But apparently, it is also because of the English language barriers. A quarter of the report authors answered that they struggled with understanding English language literature when writing their reports. So this indicates that language barriers indeed pose a serious barrier to the uptake of scientific knowledge that is available only in English. Okay, now that we know language barriers can have serious consequences for conservation, the question is how we can solve these problems. I'd say it's not easy at all, and we definitely need a concerted effort at every level, from individuals to institutions and societies. I won't have time to go into details of potential solutions, but in this article, we compiled 10 simple tips for overcoming different types of language barriers in science. So please do have a look at this paper if you are interested. Okay, so that basically concludes my talk today. Lastly, I'd like to thank all the collaborators of our Translate project for the truly huge contribution. We are working on many other exciting research and solutions, so please do visit our website. And if you are interested, contact us anytime. Thanks very much for listening. Thank you.